Thank you everybody for joining us today. It's our last session as part of Leeds Digital Festival, our BGSS webinar. We are recording today's session and we do want you to ask any questions, so do feel free to do so in the Q&A functionality. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Danny Amini to introduce today's session.
Thank you, Karen. Hello, welcome everybody. I hope you're having a great day and that you've had a good Leeds Digital Festival. So this session this afternoon is Azure Landing Zones, how to deploy Azure with confidence, which I think is going to be a pretty interesting and insightful session. We've got two great speakers today. We've got Mark Lamb, who is Head of Azure Technology at BGSS, joined ably by his colleague John Duckmanton, who's a cloud consultant also at BGSS. So they're going to talk through their presentation today, a load of great content in there. If you've got any questions while they're speaking, please feel free to use the Q&A panel, and then what we'll do is at the end we will go through and I will ask the guys questions. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Mark.
Hello everybody. I've just missed that slide off, but here we go. There's John and myself. Let me move straight on. We've got we're going to talk today about obviously Azure Landing Zones. This is a brief agenda on it. We've got common cloud adoption challenges, what are landing zones and how they can help for you, and how you can get started using them in Microsoft Azure. And obviously, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please just drop them in the channel and we'll get back to them later on. So here we go. Have you experienced this? You have started building Azure with an existing team. It's got bigger and bigger. All of a sudden, you've got compliance, trust, and efficiency. They all start becoming questions that need to be answered. All of a sudden, you see surprise bills, non-compliance, data exposure, lack of consistency in building across your teams. Little control, it all starts running out of control, and potentially you get performance issues. And these are all things that you can see that I've bumped into, my colleagues have bumped into, but a list there of what can happen to you. And this is the challenge with public clouds. You've got all of these options. You could spend whatever you want to, and there's lots of compliance and regulatory concerns so that you need to take account of. And usually you're doing this with a team that is already working on something else. So you're trying to push it in, and this is what usually comes out. And obviously that list, it's not exhaustive. It could go on and on, but that is what you can come across. Hopefully you haven't experienced this, but I'd be surprised if you haven't. So this is how you've all probably got here whenever you come across coming into cloud in Azure, especially. You've got a data center and you have all of those processes that you need to look at whenever you're building out how you can start obtaining that value out of cloud. But it obviously has some of its own hindrances and its own quirks that you need to understand, or you hit issues quickly. So public cloud does have that benefit. It reduces that time frame to value. You've got lots of things that are done for you. So you have platform services. You've got all the bits where you don't have to manage operating systems or patching. You have a lot of infrastructure as code, or it's written much more simply for you to implement complex solutions fast. And you can do all of that. However, whenever you want to do it and do it in a structured way, it's pretty difficult as well, because you still have to go back up this level to start looking at all of your policy, all of your regulatory concerns, your security, etc., who can access what, and that's where you can grind to a halt again there. So there's another way to look at this one as well. There's a thing about self-service. So we're looking at, this is a Gartner model for self-service. So you want to be able to give people the opportunity to use the cloud, but use it to build your business value fast. That's what you're after. The reason you want to use these advertised services that say they can give you all of this magic that can really evolve your company fast, to let you deploy the best and latest applications in secure manners. It's still a difficult journey to go on. And if you see on that slide, you have the different versions. This is sort of a capability maturity model, if you look at it, with optimized sessions at the end. So at your stage 5, which is obviously what you want to get to, is being able to vend accounts. And you vend something where you say, I'm able to get hold of a secure box, a chunk of Azure that has all the right bits set up in it so that I can start building what I want to build that will give my company that value, that bleeding edge quickly, but make sure that I do it so it's resilient, it's scalable, and it's got all of the right guardrails in place. And as you can see, that can go across all the clouds, but this is specifically what we're talking about here, is about the Azure version of that one. And this allows you to go onto that next level there. So we've got here, what we're talking about is the Azure Landing Zone. So this is what it is. It's a configured environment. It's a standard set of secured cloud infrastructure with policies, best practices and guidelines and centrally managed services. So whole chunk of things in there that we built into this here. You've got security and identity baselines. So you'll use the integrated tooling. This is your security center and all of these bits as your Sentinel. You've got all of your log analytics, but it'll show you everything there that allows you to see that's where I need to be, and quickly have a single pane of glass that shows me just where I need to be and where the gaps are, more importantly. Governance framework and guardrails. So obviously, as a company, you are working towards different regulatory standards, say PCI DSS. You could be wanting to follow ISO 27001 or CIS. The list's not, there's quite a few of them. I'm working on projects that use, say, UK official or UK NHS type policies. But these are all things that are available within the Azure Landing Zone. You also then, if you want to vend out this thing, you'll have core shared services. Now, you have management structures within Azure that make it easier to apply controls at various levels. So within this, you've got management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, which are all logical containers for things that resources can run within, and also extensible areas so that you can plug in networking. You've got bits there that you can have secure for Azure Key Vault and have logging centralized within a log analytics platform. So all of your core services are deployed and consumable rapidly. Go back onto them, you've got monitoring, alerting, logging. So they are all the tools within Azure. You've got Azure Monitor, you've got log analytics, you've got alerting action groups, you've got all of those services in there. They are deployed as part of a landing zone to then very quickly give you that visibility of how your environment is performing and give you that deep insight into anything that's going on, should there be issues with, say, access control, etc. You've got all of that out of the box. Again, then you want to demark who can do what within your Azure deployment. You have security, you have networking, you want to be able to have role segregation within there. So you can deploy out role assignments that users can be put into that give them access to only what they need to do. So you've got segregation of duties in there and least privilege. So you're saying, well, I'm a network administrator. I can manage VNets, subnets, network security groups, service endpoints, but all the controls or the components that are part of the networking bag. Yeah. And then you also want to add on to there, well, best practices for big enterprises that you would use even within a data center, where you may well have labels on things, for example, but putting resource locks on stuff so that whenever it's deployed, it can't be inadvertently deleted without taking some steps. It provides some control there. You can have a consistent naming framework. So there's a naming standard. So whoever comes up to this knows exactly what that is. It's not a hodgepodge of well, it could be that, it could be this. You've got a standard framework that basically when something's deployed, it's got to be called that. And it's, yeah, nice and easy to understand ongoing. And then tagging in Azure, which is a very powerful thing that allows you, for example, when it comes to cost management, to deliver your infrastructure, but tag it to say, well, I'm actually owned by marketing, or they take a share of this, or this cost center runs that. So when it comes out to say monthly reporting, etc., you will have that information there for you wrapped up, but it can say, great, that cost center or that business unit owes XYZ. So all of that's built in. Final bits there, we've got templated environments. This is really crucial here. So we're deploying this as code. So this whole thing gets deployed out, but it's all written in different codes, different coding standards. So let's say ARM and Terraform. I don't want to jump into what my colleague John's going to talk about in a bit, but you can understand that you've got some, there's basically the languages are written in, they are well-known languages, but they are there that they can be stored in source control, they can be versioned, they can be worked upon, and it's all there ready to be deployed and then repeatably deployed. So you've got immutable infrastructure that you can just keep on doing what you need to do with, and know what you built is what is in your repository is what you get out of the back end. All right, I did cover the cost controls piece there. So let's look at how it can touch your or help your teams here. So for example, hopefully the guys, whoever's on the call, you have a breakdown of a team such as this. You may have a product owner or project manager, platform engineering or infrastructure engineers, DevOps, people working in a DevOps fashion, but maybe calling themselves DevOps engineers. You've got security or DevSecOps, and you've obviously got a live service at the end. And these are the benefits that a landing zone can provide to you. Looking at the product owner, so say their challenge has been, we want to deliver a brand new application. We're going to have this great shiny thing that runs on my phone and can let me very quickly provide benefit to customers. This can reduce all of that very quickly because it gives you all of the infrastructure with all the control around it quickly, and there you go. Now you can start developing upon it in a manner that you know has the guardrails around it. And similarly, if we look at another way, the journey to cloud, let's say you're migrating your data center, you want to move that into Azure. Now, this then does provide the same sort of thing. So then you have the framework, you've got the landing zone, and there you can start doing the migration exercises, and you can start ramping up from there onto that scalable platform. Then you've got, say, your platform teams. So they want to know, well, great, what is my infrastructure and will it always look the same? Well, it's stored in source code. There you go. That's where it is. You make it so you can't muck about in the portal to change things. Obviously, there's some detail there, but as a whole, you will have consistency in your infrastructure. You've got the guardrails built in for your platform team, so they can't inadvertently do things that they might want to, not deploy a ginormous VM or a huge Databricks instance. You can actually say, well, no, actually, these are what you can do, these are what you can't do, or you will have, say, checkpoints for should you want to, well, there's processes for doing this, but it stops that, say, what would you call it, being burnt by cost all of a sudden because something's just popped out. And obviously you've got that innovation's then supported because people can use the services, but know that they can use them in a controlled manner. Then you look at your security teams or your DevSecOps. They can look at source code and know, well, that's what was deployed. So you have a secure by design model. You've got a version code base, so you know who did what to where and when, and then how it's deployed. And compliance as code, that's key. So it says, well, these things are deployed, that policy or that initiative in Azure, which is a collection of policies, that has been deployed onto the infrastructure. And there you go, it's in the code. You want to validate it, but you can check because it's all there. And also it's there for, you can then extend on that. So here's a new policy, well, just add it in and then redeploy it. That can all be done using the landing zone. And also the deep insight that you get around security. So you've got all of your Azure Security Center, your Sentinel, all the new shiny bits that are coming out, all the renaming that Microsoft does every other week, Azure Defender and etc. That's all there for you. And so you can then get that deep insight, and your security guys know that your roles are segregated, who's owners of your subscription or who isn't, and you've got all of that insight there. And finally, when it goes into live service, they can have all the run books. They've got very clear cost. They can see costs closely, and it's an extensible thing. So it's in live, but you want to do something else. Well, actually, it's a code change. Here's a new service to bolt onto it. Yes, there you go. So you can just start building up and up and up, and there you go. You've got a landing zone, and you've got all of your new services up and running on it. And obviously, you can integrate with third-party tools such as Splunk, etc. Just, well, again, by deployment. So I hope that was of use. I'm going to hand over to my colleague John now, who's going to talk in a lot more detail about the actual implementation of this.
Thanks, Mark. So if you just want to stop sharing, I'll just switch to my part of the presentation. Great. So let me know if you can see this. We should be on the same slide. This is us virtually handing over the clicker as if we were standing on a stage there. Yeah, so thanks, Mark. That all sounds good. So now we've got an understanding of what a landing zone is in principle, and the sort of benefits you can get from using a landing zone, the type of challenges that it helps you to overcome. So what I'd like to do is basically to take you through how you get started in deploying a landing zone and getting your workloads operating in the cloud. So the first thing to say is not all landing zones are created equal. So the term landing zone is an industry term, but it's quite a good analogy to use as well in terms of the pictures I've got there on the right-hand side in terms of preparing an airstrip for your workloads, which would be the planes that want to land in that environment. And obviously, depending on your needs and your requirements, that landing zone may need to look completely different. So what I've outlined here are a few of the key considerations that you might need to bear in mind when you're choosing your initial landing zone to get started in the cloud. So the first thing is, what is your actual motivation to move into the cloud? So typically what we see is things like a data center exit, where people are looking to do an on-premise migration, or it may be that your company's wanting to write the next killer app and disrupt the market, and they want to get started quickly, and they're up against time. They don't want to spend a lot of time spinning up lots of infrastructure. So they want to leverage the cloud to do that. Similarly, if you want to support innovation within a business and you want to use some of the new technologies and the new capabilities, such as AI, for example, there's a very topical one these days, or some of the other big data capabilities, analytics capabilities that are available in the cloud that you really can't get now on on-premise environments. Or maybe you're actually trying to start a full digital transformation and you want to move your entire digital estate into the cloud to get cost savings or efficiency savings. So these can be different drivers in terms of the type of landing zone that you start with. Similarly, where are you on the journey to cloud? So are you just starting with this cloud thing and you don't really quite understand what it is yet, and you need to actually run before you can walk? Or maybe you've been using the cloud for a long time. Maybe you've been using another vendor such as AWS or Google, and you just want to get started in a multi-cloud environment with Azure. Also, another key consideration is your target operating model. So by this, what I mean essentially is, are you looking to operate in the cloud in a decentralized way, a centralized way, or an enterprise way? So if you're running a decentralized way, that would be typically where you might have, I don't know, different business units might want to operate their own cloud services in complete isolation from each other, and have their own autonomy and management. Or you may be looking for a more centralized model where you have typically what we would call a cloud center of excellence that would be responsible for managing and operating all of the cloud environments that you're running. And the final point would be, really simple one. Do you have the skills required to manage the landing zone? So it may be that you actually need to, as part of your journey to the cloud, that you need to either recruit or develop skills internally to be able to operate the cloud. So you might not be able to take on an enterprise landing zone from day one. So what I'd just like to do is to take a quick look at the entry points that Microsoft offers with the standard landing zone offerings that they have, first of all. And there are two key entry points. The first one is called Start Small and Expand. And this is really for, you know, the types of situation where you actually want to either take a single migration into the cloud for maybe testing or proof of concept, MVP type setup, or you actually want to do this kind of start small, learn as we go, take a single workload into the cloud, and then expand out from that. And if you want to take that roadmap, then Microsoft offers, actually there are kind of three variants that you can start with. The first one is called the CAF Migration Landing Zone Blueprint, CAF being Cloud Adoption Framework. So all of the landing zone capability within Microsoft comes under a thing called the Cloud Adoption Framework. And I've put the link on this slide, so if you want to find more information about that and about these specific landing zones, you can go there and do that. But the CAF Migration Landing Zone Blueprint is specifically designed really to get the basic cloud services up and running really quickly, and the migration toolkit so that you can actually start to migrate VMs and or database environments into the cloud. On top of that, you can then apply a thing called the CAF Foundation Blueprint, which really adds some basic policy controls, such as Mark talked about earlier around tagging, cost management, and some basic governance policies that are applied as part of the landing zone blueprint. And we talked about a little bit about skill sets. One of the key things is that by default, the migration zones are actually deployed as ARM templates. So if you've already got skills in ARM templates, then that's great. If you've already got skills in Terraform, then you may want to look at the CAF Terraform module. So this deploys the same environment as the CAF Foundation Blueprint, but it's deployed using Terraform rather than using ARM templates. So the second entry point is a thing called Enterprise Scale, and this is actually quite new from Microsoft. And with that in mind, I'm actually going to take you through a little bit more of the detail of that shortly. But Enterprise Scale is really where you're essentially, you know what you're doing, and you've got a large number of workloads that you want to get into the cloud quite quickly, whether that be migrations or whether that's new capability. And you want to deploy this enterprise-ready platform with all of the things that Mark talked about earlier, all of the governance guardrails, security policies, network design, and everything already in there, ready to go as quickly as possible, so you can start delivering value from your workloads. So these are the standard entry points, if you like, from Microsoft. But it's worth noting that companies like ourselves, Microsoft partners like ourselves at BJSS, we do this quite a lot. And what we tend to have are customizations of these landing zones that are applicable to different industries that might have different compliance requirements. Mark talked a little bit about, for example, UK Official and NHS. There are lots of organizations that in particular have very specific compliance needs. Obviously, highly regulated industries like finance, and or you might have complex networking environments. So we have a number of these landing zone options that are available that we use on our engagements. Okay, so just to give you a flavor of what a landing zone actually looks like and what you get in there, I thought it would be good to have a quick tour of the CAF Enterprise Scale landing zone. And I just highlight some of the key features and some of the key design considerations that you might need to think about if you're looking to deploy this landing zone. So I don't expect you to understand everything on the picture in front of you at this stage. So what I'm going to do is essentially walk through some of the key components of this. The first one being what are called tenant or the tenant typically, which is a best practice, and a mechanism called management groups, which is actually key to particularly the kind of governance framework for your landing zone. So for those of you that don't know, if you're new to Azure, there's a capability called management groups, and that's the bit in the middle of the box there. And what that basically, it's kind of like an organizational hierarchy, but it's also kind of not. What it's really used for is it's a container that you deploy subscriptions, individual subscriptions into, but that what you can do is you can apply some of your governance policies and your role definitions and things like that at the management group level, and they will be automatically then inherited down into every subscription that's a part of that management group. So it really cuts the overhead of managing an enterprise environment where you typically might have hundreds of subscriptions underneath there. So if you want to change a governance policy, for example, you can just change the policy, deploy the new policy to the management group, and that will automatically cascade down to all of the subscriptions that belong with it. And what's also really useful, particularly in the enterprise scale landing zone, is that you can see we've got different types of management group for different types and classifications of subscription. So we've got, for example, a management group called platform, which is really where you're applying all of the, mostly actually really role assignments for managing the actual shared services platform itself, which I'll talk about in a little while. Then you've got another management group for your landing zones themselves. And typically you might break that down into perhaps individual business units underneath that. Another pattern that we see quite often is, and actually a best practice is to break that down into, for example, production versus non-production workloads, so you can separate out those. And then finally on the right hand side, we've got sandbox management group. And what's really great about that is that you can apply a different set of governance and compliance policies to the sandbox management group, and you can have subscriptions underneath that sandbox management group that are really kind of free from some of the regulation that you might apply to production workloads, to allow people to, you know, innovate and experiment, maybe leverage new features of Azure that you really don't want to put into production yet. People can play around with them with less kind of compliance overhead. It's very easy to manage from a management group perspective. And the other thing that I think Mark touched on earlier that's actually inherent, it's not obviously shown on the diagram, but it's inherent in the enterprise scale landing zone framework, and that is a consistent standard naming convention. And I can't stress that enough, actually, because I've done a lot of these implementations now, and one of the first things people get hung up on is how do we name things. And as Mark said, it's really important that you have consistent naming, and where that can be enforced by the landing zone implementation. And along with that, there's a recommended standard tagging taxonomy, which you would obviously potentially extend, but it gives you a great starting point to understand how to manage cost control. So how to get cost reports sliced and diced by different tags, so by business unit or by device type, by resource owner, etc. And also how to do things like auditing, you know, who owns this thing, how many of these things have we got within the environment. So the next part of the jigsaw is called the foundational services, and this is really where there are three separate subscriptions in the enterprise scale one. This is really where those foundational core services that are needed by all of your workload subscriptions are established. So this is things like all of your network connectivity. So typically if you have a hub and spoke type network model, for example, then in this case, we've got a deployment here using Azure Virtual WAN as the hub, giving you connectivity out to the internet and giving you connectivity on-prem through either ExpressRoute or VPN. It also deploys centralized log analytics workspace and Azure Monitor implementations. And again, that's really key in an enterprise environment, is to have a single logging workspace where all of your logging information is flowing into, so that you've got that single pane of glass, that single view of what's going on. You've got then the ability to hang off of that consistent alerting mechanisms and consistent report mechanisms. And then there are other key services that are part of that. For example, Azure Key Vault for securing your core services, your certificates and secrets. Network Watcher is deployed by default to give you network analytics and traffic analytics across all of your platform. And things like recovery services vaults are all in that shared services layer. Excuse me. And then we come on to the actual user workload subscriptions themselves. As Mark said, what you really want to be able to do is when an app workload owner comes to the CCOE, for example, and says, okay, we want to deploy a new app into the cloud, you want to be able to facilitate that as quickly as possible. So Within enterprise scale, what you would do is, as Mark was suggesting earlier, you would vend a new subscription. And this diagram on this page here is really kind of showing you what you would get out of the box with that vended subscription. And the vending happens automatically through a CI/CD pipeline. But what you get is this pre-configured environment that's already wired up with peer networking back to your hub, with all of your routing, UDRs, NSGs, DNS pre-configured, any other network rules that you need to apply, routing, for example, already applied. And again, the core services are already there for you to use. You've got the Key Vault, Security Center, Network Watcher, etc., as we talked about earlier. But again, the other key thing is that what you can and can't do then in that landing zone is already applied by definition of the guardrails that have been applied to the management group that subscription is in. So depending where you actually target that landing zone, the policies, the governance, compliance, the role assignments, and everything will inherit through ensuring that the people that are ultimately putting a workload into that environment can only do the things that you want them to do. So, for example, they can't deploy to a region that you don't want them to deploy to. They can't deploy resources that you don't want them to deploy. And certain configuration that you expect to be there, like, for example, even the simple things like the tagging. So if they spin up new resources, you would want those resources to be tagged automatically. So you can ensure through policy that things like those tags are automatically assigned, naming conventions are adhered to, etc., etc. And it makes it a really easy environment then for app workload owners to deploy their applications into. This diagram also shows a sandbox subscription, which I talked a little bit about earlier. And the idea there with sandbox subscriptions, as I said, is really don't overly govern those subscriptions. The sandbox subscriptions don't typically have a network connectivity back to your other production workloads, so they're pretty safe to use. And what you would want to do is really kind of have a minimum governance layer on there. You'd still have some governance around that. Again, services that might cost a lot of money, or you might have, again, monitoring so that you can see what's going on from a network exposure point of view. But you really want to use the sandbox as a playground for people to innovate and kind of experiment. And the last piece of the enterprise scale architecture is the platform automation and DevOps. And this is essentially where enterprise scale is deployed and managed. So if you look at Azure Enterprise Scale, it actually comes as Mark said, it comes as code. So it's stored in a version controlled Git repository as a series of templates and role and policy definitions, essentially. And then those templates, role and policy definitions are deployed into your production environment or into your Azure environment through a series of deployment pipelines. And there are typically these four that are shown on this diagram. So you've got the actual provisioning of subscriptions themselves. So again, workload owner comes along and says, I need a new part of Azure carved out for me to use. You would just subscription provision using a pipeline. If you want to apply or update a role, if you want to apply or update a policy, or the actual platform itself initially is deployed as a pipeline. So all of those shared services I talked about earlier are managed as a pipeline. And the idea is that you essentially version your landing zone. So when you want to make changes, you just make changes to the repository, then the pipeline will trigger and update that version automatically. The last thing to say on this is this thing about the platform DevOps team. So this is a recommendation from Microsoft, but essentially what it talks about is quite often we hear the phrase center of excellence used in terms of in the same place, if you like, as this platform DevOps team terminology that Microsoft use. And that's typically, your DevOps engineers and your infrastructure architects that are defining the platform itself, so the platform as code. And then you've typically got other roles that make up that DevOps team as well. So you've typically got what Microsoft calls SecOps, which would be your security team, security operations team, and they would manage all of the role-based assignments. They'd manage the certificates, etc., within key management. They'd manage the definition of security policy and obviously your security and audit controls and things like that, security related items. And again, we saw earlier that the subscriptions are broken down in such a way that you can kind of, if you like, isolate least privilege across those subscriptions, so that you've only got, for example, the security operations team accessing the subscriptions and the resources that relate to security. And then you've got your NetOps team, which would be managing all of the network configuration and changes. But I think what's an important pattern here, and it comes back to what Mark was saying earlier in terms of the Gartner self-service model, is that the idea really of having a landing zone is that you can create this, if you like, curated, governed environment that people can deploy workloads into with kind of a very low level of friction. So the idea is that what you want to do is the application owner's own DevOps team would manage their individual workload. One of the great things about enterprise scale is that that team they don't have to use the same tooling. They can use whatever tooling they want. If they wanted to, they could go in and deploy through the portal. You probably wouldn't want to do that. Typically, they might want to use their own CI/CD tooling, for example. Maybe they want to use Jenkins or the Atlassian stack, or they want to use a different Azure DevOps implementation. That's all fine, because all of the guardrails and the checks and balances are applied and being monitored live in Azure by the landing zone configuration. So if they try to change something, if they try to spin something up that they shouldn't, it'll stop them. If they try to change a configuration that they shouldn't change, or then again the guardrails can prevent that or remediate that from happening. So you don't have to restrict them in terms of their ability to deploy the way that they want to deploy and manage the way that they want to manage. So that was a kind of quick tour of the enterprise scale landing zone. Hopefully it's given you a flavor for the sort of things that you get out of the box there from Microsoft. And as I said, typically you'd start to customize that before you deploy it. I just want to finish with a quick note from experience that basically quite often when you hear presentations and people talking about landing zones, it's quite often kind of phrased in terms of it being a silver bullet solution to cloud adoption, and you just need to deploy a landing zone and off you go. And actually, you know what, that is true, and particularly if you're dealing with smaller workloads, or if you're doing that MVP startup type model, then absolutely you can get up and running with one of those small scale landing zones very, very quickly. But in our experience, when you're looking to deploy something like enterprise scale landing zone, you might want to reset your expectations slightly from hours and days to maybe weeks. And typically these are the sort of activities that would need to happen to get from your initial starting point to you having your first landing zone deployed in production, ready to take on board user workloads. So typically in the first 1 or 2 days, you need to establish your team. In some organizations, that's the hardest bit, finding resources and herding them, getting them all into a room at the same time. But, you know, establishing that team, your CCOE team, your DevOps team, and defining that operating model. So deciding how you want to actually run in the cloud. What are you going to do, whether you're going to do centralized, decentralized, enterprise, et cetera, et cetera. And then you'd probably go into maybe up to a week of looking at your initial workloads, understanding what those workloads look like, what the needs of those workloads are, to help you to choose the correct landing zone implementation based on the sort of guidelines I outlined earlier. And typically you won't find an exact match out of the box. You'll find one that's pretty close, but then what you might need to do is identify where you've got things that need to change, or where you've got additional requirements that you might need to apply to that landing zone before it's ready for you to use. So then you go into this kind of proving phase where you deploy that landing zone into a dev test environment, play around with it, implement any customizations that you've identified, maybe deploy some workloads in there on a test basis to make sure that everything works correctly, and people can get familiarized with how it's going to work. Go around that loop a few times in terms of that feedback and refinement until you're ready to go. And then at that point, because everything's defined as infrastructure as code, it's pretty easy then. Probably it says a week here, but probably quicker than that. You could actually get that landing zone then deployed into your production Azure environment. At that point, you're then ready to start thinking about vending your initial workload subscriptions, and then starting to onboard those workloads and bring them into Azure and start to move towards a BAU daily operations type model. So I just thought it would be useful to kind of share that experience in terms of setting expectations around deploying a landing zone. So with that, I think, Mark, I'm just going to hand back to you to kind of summarize, and then I guess we can take some questions from the audience.
Yeah, that's fine. Let me just, sorry about that. The screen has just gone up. Can you open up the I'm afraid I'm having technical difficulties. PowerPoint isn't opening for me. Summary slide.
Sure. Just bear with me a second.
Oh wait, it's coming again. Wait.
You got it?
Yeah, there we go. Can you see that? Yeah, is that visible?
Yep.
Yeah, all right then. So thank you, John. Hopefully that was informative. I'll just give you that summary there. So you've got a solid foundation to start your cloud adoption journey in a governed way. The landing zone, it can accelerate your time to value. It's fully aligned to this Microsoft Cloud Adoption best practices, all the cloud adoption framework. Really good reading. I do recommend you go and have a look at that, because a lot of effort's being put into that, and it grows day by day. You've obviously got your built-in security and compliance guardrails. So it's brilliant nowadays. So you've got that and so much control there out of the box, ready for you to use. That therefore builds on to simplifying your support and maintenance. You've got infrastructure as code enabled as default, and you can deploy full environments in days or weeks instead of months. I hope you enjoyed that. Over to Dan, I think.
Yeah, thank you. If anyone has got any questions, please feel free to ask them on the chat. I don't see any at the moment, but no, thanks chaps. That was ace. I really enjoyed that. I've got a couple of questions actually. Just made me think. So one, what do you think are what are the recommended or prerequisite skills you might suggest to somebody who's looking at picking up landing zone? You know, what kind of things would they need really to get started?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dan. And to be honest, the answer is really no different to if you were trying to just start on Azure adoption generally, in that really the best place to start is the kind of the Microsoft certifications. So the administrator certification is a really great start. That covers a lot of the technologies that are used by the landing zone capability. And also the DevOps engineer certification. So if you look at the skill set that's required for those two roles, if you like, in the Microsoft Learn framework, they really align quite closely to the skill set that you need for landing zones. Landing zones essentially is not a different product. It's just Azure packaged up and configured in a certain way to make it easy to consume. So you don't need any different skills than you would need to operate Azure generally. I think the only differentiation I would make really is in terms of that deployment technology around ARM templates versus Terraform, because it may be that in your organization you're already using Terraform. Maybe you've got other projects or other cloud platforms that you're using Terraform for, where you've got a skill set. You can bring those skills to Azure Cloud Landing Zones quite effectively. If you haven't got Terraform skills, the recommendation would be to start with ARM templates, because that's really the kind of Azure native out of the box solution, and really there's a little bit more kind of native support from Microsoft on that.
Okay, excellent. Okay, thank you. And it's another one as well. You'd mentioned data center migration as a kind of a really great kind of case for why landing zone could really kind of accelerate. How does landing zone equate to application modernization?
So you've got I'll answer that one yet. So you've got your landing zone. Let's look at a use case, something that I have worked on recently. Deploying a landing zone, you've got that out. We did that quite rapidly. And then what did you want to bolt onto it? It was looking at an Azure Kubernetes service. So what would we like to do? We want to host some, no, well, it's app modernization. We want to move our apps. So we've got some old .NET stuff running on-prem, on IIS, etc. Managed to use that. So you've got your landing zone set up. You have some VNet peering put in because we had a different subscription with the AKS cluster within it. And then we use that, and it worked really well. There was consideration for using application services, app services in Microsoft parlance, but this was a large deployment. So yeah, AKS was better suited for that, Dan. Yeah, but it does, it fits in really well. And again, all of the what came out of it allowed it to be controlled and be very quickly brought live.
So I guess what you're saying is it could be used for greenfield, it could be used for migration of existing workloads, or entire data center migration, really everything.
Yeah.
Okay, just another one then, maybe on a similar vein. I think a lot of the conversation here today has been around enterprise scale. I mean, I'm just wondering if you know, someone in the audience there is in a smaller organization, maybe has a bit more of a startup mentality. How might you look at landing zone, and how relevant is it for them and their organizations that may be slightly smaller?
Yeah. No, that's another great question, Dan. So I think this is actually where it's one of the key cases where landing zones, I think, shine, because one of the key challenges or the key barriers really to a successful adoption of the cloud is that understanding of that kind of cloud mentality and the skill sets that you need to sort of turn all of the dials to make Azure work correctly. And as Mark alluded earlier in the sort of the challenges to adoption, a lot of people don't initially, when they're moving to the cloud, they don't worry about, you know, some of the things they might otherwise need to worry about, like compliance and guardrails and you know, kind of data leakage and some of those things. And if you're a startup, typically you're probably not in the space where you understand all of these things, and you really just want to get your application into a cloud environment, you know, basically to make it scale or to make it reach more broadly, maybe around, you know, kind of global audience, or you want to start quickly with it. And you don't want to spend a lot of time learning all of these kind of technologies that you need to understand in order to make this work. So that's why really Microsoft did those initial, you know, start small and expand landing zones, where you can basically deploy those very, very quickly. As a startup, you can get up and running in a few days, probably less, with those landing zones without having to understand really the skills that have gone behind that. It's pre-built for you. You just deploy your apps into those landing zones and off you go. So absolutely brilliant for startups.
Okay. I've got a question here from Ben. Thanks for the question. How open are the guardrails, and how do consumers know what they can do within a landing zone, and kind of what are the expectations of it for them?
Yeah, that's another great question, and that's a really difficult one, because it's there are two elements to this. One is the technology, and one is the, if you like, the process and the policy and the communication. So within Azure, the recommendations from Microsoft, and our recommendations too, is when you're applying these policies, wherever possible, you don't set them up to just prevent people from doing things, particularly when you're starting out. So in Azure policy, there are different effects that you can apply to policies. So the first one being a deny policy, which is basically you're not allowed to do that thing. And there are some cases where you would want to use that. So if you don't want to deploy outside of let's say you don't deploy outside of a European region, for example, for data sovereignty requirements, then obviously you would stop people deploying resources except in approved regions. But then there are other policies that are applied through effectively an audit effect. So if somebody does something that's outside of the compliance guardrails, then it will audit and it will flag that up inside Azure policies and audit, and you can create alerts around that, things like that. And that's a really great way for sort of helping people to understand what they can and can't do, is that, you know, they just get a kind of a compliance report come out of Azure saying, well, you know, you shouldn't really be doing these things. Can you remediate this, that, and the other? But the real answer to that is actually to, as part of, and this is really part of that kind of operating model, is to document and sort of communicate what the guardrails are that have been put in place, because there are lots of them. As Mark alluded to earlier, you know, depending on your compliance requirements, there can be hundreds of these policy guardrails that are applied. So it is important that people understand what they can and can't do, and that really comes down to communication fundamentally.
Yeah, Ben's actually just clarified actually on his question, say about he's asking about transparency. So how do folks know where the guardrails are? So I guess that's a question about security centre and policy initiatives, and that, yeah, really, I guess giving the consumers visibility of what the policy is before they actually go and hit it. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I mean, you mentioned security centre there, and that's probably one of the places. So Azure Policy and Azure Security Centre are kind of the two main places where guardrails are surfaced in Azure. And what we would expect to do is that, you know, people can just kind of go in there and look at the policy. So as Mark said, there are things called policy initiatives, typically, which are groups of individual policies kind of aligned together to, like, for example, there's a set for CIS 1.1 compliance, for example. The set of policy initiatives that are applied, and you can go into Azure Security Centre as a user, provided you've got access, and have a look at the policy guardrails that are applied as part of those initiatives. And you can actually, if you want to, you can drill right down into the definition of specifically what resources it's turning on or off, or what rules it's applying, and that will give you some transparency into what's happening.
Okay,
Yeah, hopefully, could I add, as part of your project, you would have them, they'd be documented, because you'd have a standard set of them that would say this is what you can and can't do. And then it would be, that's where you could find them. I think that's how I'm reading the question from Ben. It's more about if I'm using that platform, where would I see what they are? And you'd hope it would be within the documentation of the platform to say that they are what are applied, and that's where you can't really they're your guardrails essentially. That's where you'd find it.
Yeah. Okay, thanks Ben for your question. And I suppose I've worked on a project as well recently where, and I know it's been covered in here, but how you align those policies with the management groups gives this incredible flexibility to, you know, change that policy and those policy sets across your workloads versus your landing zone as well. So yeah, I mean, it's great question, Ben. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. So we don't have any other questions. So I guess we will wrap up. I don't know if Karen, shall I hand over to you? But thank you very much, and thanks for everyone for joining.
Yeah, thank you. That's the end to our last session of this year's Leeds Digital Festival. I must just add, as a shameless plug, we are hiring. So there'll be a link to all the opportunities that we've got when I do the follow-up email with a link to the recording. And so thanks again, guys, for leading this session today. I hope everybody's enjoyed the festival. If you've got any more events to attend, I hope they go well, and we will see you all soon. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.